Hello, everyone. How you doing? Okay, so I left links and things in the comments today. I hope you can see them from where you are. They've appeared in the YouTube comments. I don't know why they appear only in the YouTube comments since I'm streaming to 3 places, but that's what it's about. Steve Wolfbrand says, let's do it. Dolores Pierce says, hi all. Dolores Pierce says, sharing. Thank you, Dolores. Kay says, hi everybody. Glad to see you. Glad to see you, Kay. Carmen says, hello, Jello. That's Jello J. Rockefeller, not me. Kay says, hi, Joe. Lana says, hi, all. Ghost Start says, share. Kyle's about to be canceled. Why is Kyle about to be canceled? Who's canceling him? You mean on YouTube? Steve says, Doc, we got to get Back to the Future. Lana Dell says, hi, Steve. That's Steve Gonzo. Okay, let's get started. There's a lot to do tonight. We start off with the infrastructure, climate infrastructure fight. It's really kind of the start of the Green New Deal fight, really. Let's start with this news about the climate emergency. Quote, this is the climate emergency, unquote. Dozens of sudden deaths reported as Canada heats 121 degrees Fahrenheit. This was by Jake Johnson on June 30th from Common Dreams. Dozens of sudden death calls that Vancouver authorities have received this week are believed to be tied to the dangerous heat wave currently scorching Canada, pushing temperatures to record levels, an event experts say is a direct result of the human-caused climate emergency. On Tuesday, the temperature hit 49.6 degrees Celsius, 121 degrees Fahrenheit in Lytton, British Columbia, an all-time high, and the third consecutive day that Canada heat has crushed records. Quote, before this heat wave, the Canada national heat record stood at 45 degrees Celsius. This record, held since July 1937, meteorologist Scott Duncan noted in a series of tweets. Along came 27th of June, smashed this by a whopping 1.6 degrees Celsius. But we were not done there. The heat wave was just getting started. The very next day, temperatures soared to a staggering 47.9 degrees Celsius, destroying the new record. This did not last long, though, unquote. Quote again, and here we are, Duncan added, and quote again, almost 50 degrees Celsius at 50 degrees north. This is desert heat in Canada. We have never seen this level of heat this far north anywhere on planet Earth until now. He tweets, this moment will be talked about for centuries. Maybe so. Maybe people won't be around for centuries to talk about it. Pointing to the alarming new figures, Swedish climate activist Greta Thunberg said that, quote, heat records are usually broken by tenths of a degree, not 4.6 degrees Celsius, unquote. We're in a climate emergency that has never once been treated as an emergency, unquote, she added. As the Washington Post reported, the record 121 degree Fahrenheit temperature in Lytton is more extreme than the all-time high in Las Vegas, which was 170 degrees, and higher than most places in the lower 48 states outside the desert Southwest. These are temperatures rarely found outside of Death Valley. The meteorologist Eric Holthouse said of Canada's record heat, quote, only a handful of places in the world have ever been this hot. The Canada heat waves comes as large swaths of the United States, from the Pacific Northwest to the Northeast, are also experiencing devastating high temperatures. At least 5 deaths have been linked to the latest U.S. heat wave, which is melting power cables, cracking asphalt roads, and intensifying wildfires. More than 1,000 people in the Pacific Northwest have been hospitalized in recent days due to possible heat-related illness. Quote, the record-shattering extreme heat we're experiencing is just the latest example of our climate crisis and how it's impacting human health now, Jeff Duchin, an officer for public health in Seattle and King County, Washington, said in a statement over the weekend, quote, climate change is a health emergency, and reducing greenhouse gas emissions is literally a matter of life, and death. So this has been a record for Vancouver. Vancouver has never experienced heat like this, says Sergeant Steve Addison. Our offices are stretched in, but we're still doing everything we can to keep people safe. The vast majority of these cases are related to the heat. According to CNN, more than 230 deaths have been reported in British Columbia since Friday, as a historic heat wave brought record high temperatures. From Friday through Monday, at least 233 deaths were reported, the chief coroner said. So people are amazed at the heat. It's really, really serious. It's obviously due to climate change. Obviously due to greenhouse gases. So one Mr. Donner, Simon Donner, a climate scientist in the University of BC's Department of Geography, said, quote, so this is not the new normal, quote, normal is going to keep changing until we stop emitting greenhouse gas emissions, unquote. So, yes, we are in it now. We're not just in for it. We are in it. So we have 200 plus climate groups. Okay, to Democrats, $6 trillion should be the floor for the climate and infrastructure bill. This also by Jake Johnson on July 1st, 2021. So, a coalition of more than 200 progressive advocacy organizations and think tanks released a joint statement Wednesday arguing that $6 trillion in spending, quote, should be the floor, not the ceiling of Democratic lawmakers' ambitions as they craft a legislative package aimed at combating the climate crisis rebuilding the nation's infrastructure, and repairing the tattered safety net. The recent bipartisan framework announced by the White House is sufficient to meet these challenges and must not advance on its own, reads the new statement. I think I said sufficient. I should have said insufficient. Is insufficient to meet these challenges and must not advance on its own, referring to the $579 billion infrastructure plan that Joe Biden touted last week, flanked by Republicans and conservative Democrats. Congress must seize the historic opportunity in the fiscal 2022 budget resolution to build on the Biden administration's proposals, set the stage for a bold reconciliation package led by the Progressive Caucus Action Fund, the Economic Policy Institute, the Institute for Policy Studies, and the Poor People's Campaign. The joint statement characterizes the $6 trillion framework, which is proposed by Bernie Sanders, as the, quote, minimum scale necessary to tackle our nation's most urgent challenges. Quote, over a 10-year period, it represents just over 1% of U.S. GDP and less than half of Pentagon spending given current trends. Okay, the proposal is reported to improve on the Biden administration's proposals by allowing Congress to expand the Medicare program, the policy supported by Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer. Senator Sanders also proposes increased funding to address climate change and provides a pathway to citizenship for millions of immigrants. Specifically, the statement calls on Congress to prioritize $1.1 trillion in public investments in clean energy and hundreds of billions of dollars more to expand and electrify public transit and retrofit our schools and homes. 2, improving and making permanent the American Rescue Plan's expansion of the child tax credit, which is currently designed, could leave out millions of poor families. Implementing a national, universal paid leave program, closing the Medicaid coverage gap, slashing prescription drug costs by allowing Medicare to negotiate prices, hiking taxes on the wealthy and large corporations. Quote, right now, too many families continue to struggle to balance childcare, family, and work, and millions struggle just to make ends meet, all while the ultra-wealthy continue to reap billions without paying their fair share. The statement reads, communities across the country are demanding a budget resolution that meets the scope and scale of this moment. The group's call come as the Democratic lawmakers are in the early stages of assembling legislation that they hope to pass along the bipartisan infrastructure package using an arcane process known as budget reconciliation, through which bills can pass with just a simple majority vote. With large swaths of the United States in the grips of record-shattering and deadly heat wave, the progressive lawmakers are demanding a reconciliation package that focuses heavily on confronting the threat posed by the climate crisis. Quote, look at what's happening in the Pacific Northwest right now, unquote, Sanders chair of the Senate Budget Committee said earlier this week, quote again, if we do not significantly invest in transforming our energy system, future generations will never forgive us. However, progressives raised the alarm on Wednesday after a leaked memo indicated the White House is focused more on what one critic described as, quote, technocratic, unquote, market-driven tweaks than the kinds of sweeping public investments that Sanders, Democratic lawmakers, and grassroots organizations are advocating. The White House memo, authored by climate advisor Gina McCarthy and senior advisor Anita Dunn, lists as administration priorities, quote, tax cuts for businesses and consumers who invest in clean energy technologies, unquote, and, quote again, sending a market signal that brings additional private investment off the sidelines and into modernizing our electric grid through an energy efficiency and clean energy standard. So watch out for that. When you hear words like that, brings additional private investments off the sidelines. No, we don't need the additional private investments off the sidelines. All the investment can and should be done by the government for the Green New Deal. Those charges should be picked up. What Anita Dunn is doing there is she's waving a hand towards the idea of private-public partnerships so her cronies can make money from the Green New Deal. So Mitch Jones, policy director at Food and Water Watch, said in the statement that the memo should be seen for what it is, little to nothing of substance. Instead of explicitly supporting a bona fide standard for clean, renewable energy, McCarthy's memo touts, quote, market signals, unquote, and the leveraging of deeply flawed existing energy systems. If the White House wants us to believe it is taking the climate crisis seriously, this memo does the opposite, unquote. Not being received well by progressive groups and also progressive lobbyists. And some more complaints by progressives. Okay, this again from Common Dreams. But Jessica Corbett is the author here, June 30th, 2021. Headline is Progressives Decry, quote, foolish and dangerous, unquote, approach of White House climate memo. This is like a follow-on to the previous article. Climate activists and experts responded with alarm Wednesday to some parts of a White House memo obtained and reported on by Axios, outlining Biden administration plans for climate and energy provisions in evolving budget reconciliation legislation. The memo, which is linked to here, dated for Tuesday, was addressed to members of Joe Biden's cabinet from the domestic climate advisor Gina McCarthy and senior advisor Anita Dunn. Comes as Democrats are working on a reconciliation package to pass alongside a bipartisan infrastructure deal announced last week by Biden and centrist federal lawmakers. The 4-page document details key components of the bipartisan infrastructure framework that quote, that advance President Biden's American Jobs Plan and vision to build back better and tackle the climate crisis, unquote, including investments in clean water and electric vehicle infrastructure, addressing pollution, legacy pollution, modernizing the country's electric. The bipartisan infrastructure framework leaves out critical initiatives on climate change that he proposed as part of his Build Back Better agenda. That is why he intends to work with Congress through the budget process to pass additional laws that will position the U.S. to combat climate change, create good-paying union jobs, and win the clean energy future, unquote. And Generation Green New Deal retweeted from Kate Aronoff. It said, this leaked White House memo on climate priorities shows a commitment to fighting for market-based peanuts through reconciliation, and leaves a link to a document. Talks about providing tax cuts for businesses, consumers who invest in clean energy technologies, sending a market signal that brings additional private investment off the sidelines, and into modernizing our electric grid through an energy efficiency and clean energy standard. Also mobilizing a next generation of conservation and resilience workers with a $10 billion investment to conserve and restore our public lands and waters, bolster community resilience, and address environmental justice, all while maximizing the creation of accessible training opportunities to create a pathway for good-paying union jobs. The concept of a civilian client core has strong bipartisan support, according to recent polling from Data for Progress. 77% of respondents support a CCC, including 65% of Republicans and 87% gave Democrats. The President remains committed to using all the tools at his disposal to drive a whole-of-government approach to tackling the climate crisis, create good-paying union jobs, and advance environmental justice. So there again, you see the signaling concerning the private sector role. And what Generation Green New Deal itself tweeted is, that's going to be a, quote, no, unquote, from us, dog. So who was the dog? I don't think Kate Aronoff. I think it's the person in the White House who wrote that. Anyway, according to the memo, the plan is going to include providing tax cuts for businesses and consumers who invest in clean energy technologies like renewables, battery storage, and electric vehicles. Sending a market signal that brings additional private investment off the sidelines. They love this market signals crap. Also mobilizing the next generation of conservation and resilience workers. That's the $10 billion investment. All while maximizing the creation of accessible training opportunities to create a pathway for good-paying union jobs. The concept of a civilian climate corps has strong bipartisan support. The plan for that was introduced by Ocasio-Cortez and Ed Markey, I believe, right? We will also continue to advance the full suite of proposals in the American Jobs Plan and American Families Plan through additional congressional action, including budget reconciliation, to ensure we build back our economy and country better. Some parts of the memo may please progressive climate activists and policymakers, such as the stated support for creating a CCC, for which Green New Deal leaders, AOC and Senator Ed Markey proposed legislation earlier this year. Kate Aronoff tweeted, the wording for the $10 billion CCC strongly suggests it's going to be structured as some kind of AmeriCorps expansion rather than, a civilian climate corps. Or as she said, rather than, a CCC. Have written about this before, but despite some genuine commitments to jobs and new federal spending, the thrust of climate Bidenomics is pretty old hat from the 90s. A little public investment to, quote, mobilize, unquote, big private investments, plus a basic reluctance to do any sort of planning. That's a very fair comment. However, progressive green groups raised alarm about the memo's language regarding an EECES, which would require a certain share of electricity to come from clean sources. Axios noted that during a live-streamed interview with Punchbowl News on Wednesday, Gina McCarthy, I suppose this is, point to it as one of the non-negotiable items in the reconciliation legislation, saying, quote, "We need that second package. We need tax credits. We need a clean energy standards. We'd love to see a civilian climate corps." That seems to be giving it up right there. We'd love to see a civilian climate corps. That's a signal. We don't need a civilian climate corps, according to that. We just love to see one. Now we know whose side Gina McCarthy is on. In a statement Wednesday, Food and Water Watch policy Mitch Jones warned that the memo should concern climate activists. The Biden administration has consistently pledged support for a clean energy standard, but only a weak one that would qualify dirty energy sources like frack gas and nuclear power as clean. Meanwhile, the White House continually praises far-fetched pro-industry projects like carbon capture as a viable solution to drastically reducing climate emissions. This approach is foolish and dangerous. This new memo, ostensibly designed to appease climate activists, should be seen for what it is. Little to nothing of substance, he continued. Quote again, "Instead of explicitly supporting a bona fide standard for clean, renewable energy, the memo touts market signals and the leveraging of deeply flawed existing energy systems. This is not a bold agenda. It is technocratic market speak that is decades out of date." Jones added, "If the White House wants us to believe it is taking the climate crisis seriously, this memo does the opposite." Food and Water Watch was one of the convening partners of a May letter marked by hundreds of groups that urged congressional Democrats to reject gas and other false climate solutions. Friends of the Earth, FOE, the U.S., another initial partner on last month's letter, also expressed concern about the energy standard language in the memo. Democrats are once again throwing the climate justice movement under the bus, declared Friends of the Earth, program manager Lucas Ross. Quote, "The Democrats have yet to write a single clean energy standard that excludes frack gas and other false solutions." Quote, "Climate activists aren't fooled by technology-neutral gimmicks," said Ross. And quote again, "Biden should not encourage proposals that peddle false solutions or that bargain away fossil fuel subsidy repeal." And Friends of the Earth even pointed out the memo, quote, "makes no mention of repealing fossil fuel subsidies, which was a key provision of the American Jobs Plan." And in a tweet to @POTUS, "There's no room for compromise when it comes to the climate crisis." The memo was sent to the cabinet the same day climate activists, also progressives in Congress, held a rally on Capitol Hill calling for an end to fossil fuel subsidies. Just one of multiple actions in Washington, D.C. this week demanding bold climate provisions in federal infrastructure legislation. The memo also came as extreme heat hit the Pacific Northwest. The fact that David V. Johnson, a former philosophy professor turned journalist, highlighted in a sarcastic tweet about the White House document. Quote, "It's 120 degrees in Portland. What market-based solutions can we bring to bear?" Unquote. And Daniel Aldana Cohn, an assistant professor of sociology at the University of Pennsylvania, he directs the Socio-Spatial Climate Collaborative, and co-author of the book, A Planet to Win, Why We Need a Green New Deal, responded to the memo with a call to action. Pure climate denialism is this White House memo on current climate priorities. But our movements need to crank up the pressure hard, he said. Here's another side of things by Dave Dayen. Let me grab it. So Dave says, Washington isn't used to the left setting the agenda. This was done on June 28th at the American Prospect. There's a picture of Nancy Pelosi during a news conference on Capitol Hill, May 13th, 2021. Michael Kinsley may no longer be at the forefront of American political commentary, but he is well remembered for coining the phrase Kinsley gaffe, which refers to when a politician tells the truth they were supposed to never say out loud. There was a doozy of a Kinsley gaffe this past week from Joe Biden, whose name was almost synonymous with gaffe as a senator, but who has been disciplined as the chief executive. Of course, he just had reached a bipartisan agreement with 10 senators and explained it was just one half of his agenda that included a separate public investment bill, the American Families Plan, which included spending on education, welfare benefits, the care economy, and more. And he said of the bipartisan measure, if this is the only thing that comes to me, I'm not signing it. And of course, Washington went crazy. It was called extortion, a double cross by Senator Lindsey Graham, left the bipartisan gang that President Biden talked to in a huff. And Senator Jerry Moran of Kansas, who's a Republican, tried to get the moderate Democrats to sabotage the reconciliation bill. Decatur Walling led the White House to walk back the statement, although careful perusal doesn't show all that much walking back. Biden said in a statement that it was certainly not my intent to give the impression that he was threatening to veto the bipartisan bill absent a follow-up. But he added that he would still move forward with the second bill under reconciliation. Quote, a bipartisan agreement does not preclude Republicans from attempting to defeat my family's plan. Likewise, they should have no objections to my devoted efforts to pass that family's plan and other bills in tandem, unquote. In other words, Biden is saying he will pursue a second bill and Republicans can go ahead and try to stop it, even though they don't have the votes, since reconciliation bills can go forward with a bare majority in the Senate. GOP members of the bipartisan gang appeared satisfied with this take on the Sunday shows, even though it's not all that different from what Biden said extemporaneously at the press conference. Incidentally, Republicans were saying pretty much the same thing as recently as 2 weeks ago. They were confident that if they passed something bipartisan that ripped away popular spending on roads and bridges and other fiscal infrastructure pieces, Democrats would not be able to get their whole caucus to reach consensus on the rest of Biden's agenda. So they were all too happy to participate in a two-stage process, and everyone was well aware that it would happen. What got Republicans so angry is that Democrats figured out a way to make the two-stage process successful. And it's so confounding to the Republicans because for the first time in anyone's memory, the political system in Washington felt more of a need to cater to the left to win votes rather than cater to the right. Biden was merely adopting The same position House Speaker Nancy Pelosi had stated just a few hours earlier, quote, "We will not take up a bill in the House until the Senate passes the bipartisan bill and a reconciliation bill," Pelosi declared. When Biden was asked specifically if he supported Pelosi's position, he said, quote, "Yes," unquote. But Biden didn't link the two bills. Pelosi did, and there's nothing that anyone in the Senate can do about it. Pelosi had to make this promise because it was the only way for anything on infrastructure to pass. Specifically, progressives who have enough numbers within the party to block legislation in the House made it very clear that they didn't trust moderates enough to follow through on a second bill without a forcing mechanism. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez floated on June 15th that the House should hold the first bill until the second bill passes the Senate. Now, folks, that's forcing the vote, really forcing the vote. Precisely what Pelosi stated would happen days later. AOC's was just the first public statement of a position relayed privately to Pelosi previously. Left-leaning members of the Senate unified with that strategy as well and made their stance clear. Pelosi is pretty cold-eyed when it comes to this stuff. She will engage in whatever strategy it takes to actually get something passed. She's stating through her actions that the threat, of the progressives walking away from the first bill in the absence of the second is greater than any moderate revolt on social spending and tax increases. That's an unusual dynamic in Congress to anyone who's been observing it over the past few decades. It's usually progressives who are always the ones that get jammed, expected to suck it up and take incremental steps rather than the whole loaf. The Affordable Care Act played out that way with a compromise off single payer, then another compromise with no public option. Countless spending bills have played out that way, with the progressives expected to vote for austerity or harmful riders or whatever else to keep the government funded and avoid a shutdown. The system recognizes the fact, that progressives generally like to pass things and have government work, and will seek out the slightest sliver of progress to justify moving forward. Yet that was not the case here. Progressives staked out a position, and the leadership knew that position was strong enough to sink the bill. So they had to cater to the left, and it wasn't enough to give private assurances. They had to be loud and public. Everyone, including Republicans, knows this is happening. Even the walk back by Biden, acknowledges the process will be exactly the same. It's just confusing to see it play out. The left doesn't set the terms of the agenda as a general rule. That rule has been broken. But, says Dave, it hasn't been fully broken, and there's one more bit of work for progressives. The fact sheet on the bipartisan bill still includes privatization schemes as one of the revenue raisers. That means that old infrastructure will be sold to pay off for new infrastructure, and that private financiers will be given concessions to run common assets for decades. Wall Street is salivating over this idea, seeing it as their, quote, big wish granted. Trump unsuccessfully sought this, and Biden is close to succeeding. This could lead to sales of the Tennessee Valley Authority, Washington Dulles International Airport, and much more. A leaked breakdown of the revenue side states that $100 billion would be put towards a privatization, which means that the sell-offs and concessions would generate that much revenue, which private companies would make back plus profit by charging users. It's inarguable that this violates Biden's vow to not raise taxes on people making under $400,000 a year. Privatization merely substitutes public tax collection for private tax collection through toll roads or increased rates on privatized water systems. The private taxation, is typically more burdensome, and it absolutely falls on the non-rich. Beyond that, democratic control is handed over to the private sector on the infrastructure we use every day. If the two-stage process simply involved some pieces of Biden's plans in the bipartisan bill and the rest in reconciliation, then the progressive linkage strategy would be sound. But accepting a significant amount of privatization in the process to realize the Trump infrastructure agenda should be too much to ask. The bills themselves probably won't fulfill all of America's infrastructure needs. Nevertheless, depending on the details, it will likely be reasonable to accept spending compromises on what will still be an abnormally large commitment to public investment compared to recent U.S. history. But if it includes selling off America in the process, Democrats on the progressive left will have to think very hard about whether that is worth it. So, Dave points out the dangers in a possible compromise on the reconciliation bill, the thrust of the Biden administration to still do deals with the private sector that do not need to be done with the private sector, to sell off public assets to private sector companies that would use them to charge us more, to put us under the thumb of heavier private taxes, basically private taxes, as opposed to less expensive public taxes. I think progressives have to stand firm on this and say, no, this is not going to be in the bill. It's got to be government spending all the way. No partnerships with the private companies in this bill. There are enough partnerships with the private companies in the freaking bipartisan bill already. That's what they got to say. Anyway, we're moving on from this fight now to neoliberalism and to the good news. And believe me, neoliberalism and the good news are in some way related. I will illuminate how they are related as we go forward. But here's the first piece. It's a column by Bob Pollin and Gerald Epstein, not Gerald Friedman, Gerald Epstein, both of the University of Massachusetts, in Amherst. Neoliberalism has depended on huge levels of government support for its entire existence. This was done on June 30th, 2021, taken from the Boston Review. It begins. The most basic tenet undergirding neoliberal economics is that free market capitalism, or at least some close approximation to it, is the only effective framework for delivering widely shared economic well-being. On this view, only free markets can increase productivity and average living standards while delivering high levels of individual freedom and fair social outcomes. But big government spending and heavy regulations are simply less effective, according to that myth. These neoliberal premises have dominated economic policymaking, both in the United States and around the world for the past 40 years, beginning with the elections of Margaret Thatcher in the UK and Ronald Reagan in the States. Thatcher's dictum that, quote, there is no alternative, Tina, Tina, to neoliberalism became a rallying cry. One of my rallying cries since about 2012 is TIA. There is an alternative. Anyway, supplanting what had been, since the end of World War II, the dominance of Keynesianism in global economic policymaking, which instead viewed large-scale government interventions as necessary for stability and a reasonable degree of fairness under capitalism. This neoliberal ascendancy has been undergirded by the full-throated support of the overwhelming majority of professional economists, including people such as Nobel laureates Milton Friedman and Robert Lucas. In reality, neoliberalism has depended on huge levels of government support for its entire existence. In other words, hugely dependent on lemon socialism. The global neoliberal economic order could easily have collapsed into a 1930s level Great Depression multiple times over in the absence of massive government interventions. Especially central to its survival have been government bailouts, including emergency government spending injections financed by borrowing, that is, deficit spending, as well as central bank actions to prop up financial institutions and markets teetering on the verge of ruin. Bailouts have therefore not only repeatedly rescued neoliberal capitalism during periods of crisis, but they have also, as a result, reinforced neoliberalism's the malignant tendencies. In 1978, just prior to neoliberalism's rise, the CEOs of the largest 350 U.S. corporations earned $1.7 million, 33 times the $51,200 earned by the average private sector non-supervisory worker. As of 2019, the CEOs were earning 366 times more than the average worker, $21.3 million versus $58,200. Under neoliberalism, in other words, the pay for big corporate U.S. CEOs increased more than tenfold relative to the average U.S. worker. This curious conjunction, theoretical disdain for government alongside practical reliance on it, has amounted to champagne socialism for big corporations. I prefer to say lemon socialism because it tastes so bad for the rest of us. Wall Street and the rich and, quote, let them eat cake capitalism for most everyone else. That is very well put, of course. The COVID-19 pandemic and recession powerfully illustrated how neoliberalism works in practice. During the pandemic, employment and overall economic activity throughout the world fell precipitously as major sections of the global economy were forced into lockdown mode. According to the IMF, overall economic activity contracted by 3.5% in 2020 in a severe collapse that has had acute adverse impacts on women, youth, the poor, the informally employed, and those who work in contact-intensive sectors, but not for all countries, as we'll see. But during the same period, global markets soared. In the United States, nearly 50% of the entire labor force filed for unemployment benefits between March 2020 and February 2021. However, over the same period, the prices of Wall Street stocks, as measured, for example, by the Standard & Poor's 500 index, a broad market indicator, rose by 46%, one of the sharpest one-year increases on record. Moreover, This increase did not simply reflect the U.S. stock market recovering from the pandemic and lockdown. As of February 2021, the Standard & Poor's 500 index was also 38% higher than 2 years prior. In March 2019, 9 months before COVID had been recognized as a human pathogen. And the 2020 stock market ascent began months before there was any clear evidence that the economy was recovering from the lockdown. All these gains are the result of large-scale government interventions, as we'll get to later. Bailouts were given, first and foremost, to boost financial markets and to help the rich. Next section is called Textbook Neoliberalism versus Bailouts 101. In textbook economics, the movements of financial markets are supposed to reflect underlying conditions in the real economy where goods and services are produced. Workers are hired and paid, and companies profit or don't in attempting to sell their products. In this scenario, when companies lay off workers, workers lose income and cut back on spending, which means companies are likely to face difficulty selling their products. Their profits should fall as a result. As unemployment rises and profits fall, the value of these companies as expressed in their stock market prices should decrease. This has not been the case over the past year. As disparities grew between conditions in the real economy and financial markets, because governments undertook really massive bailout operations in the face of the COVID-19 pandemic. In March 2020, with Donald Trump in office and Republicans controlling the U.S. Senate, the federal government enacted the CARES Act, a $2 trillion infrastructure program equal to about 10% of U.S. GDP. More than 40% of the total funding, about $850 billion, went to loans and grants for business, with only weak stipulation as to how these funds would be used. For example, large businesses could receive a loan and still lay off up to 10% of their employees, while smaller businesses could receive loans or grants without committing to retaining any employees. At the discretion of the Treasury Secretary, corporations could even engage in stock buybacks to boost their share prices with the funds. The CARES Act provided one-time cash support for people earning $75,000 or less, and significant, though temporary, unemployment insurance support for laid-off workers. In December, the CARES Act was followed by the 2020 COVID Relief Act, which was budgeted at $900 billion, another 4% injection of GDP. About 33% of the Act's funding went to an additional round of credit and grants to businesses. Together, the CARES and COVID Relief Acts amount to about 14% of U.S. GDP in 2020, an unprecedented expansion of federal government deficit spending in peacetime. Yet these massive stimulus measures were exceeded by nearly $4 trillion spent on Federal Reserve interventions, nearly 20% of U.S. GDP, to ensure Wall Street stayed afloat. Most significantly, the Federal Reserve bought financial assets, including U.S. Treasury bonds, and mortgage-based securities, and even corporate junk bonds held by money market funds, private equity lenders, and banks to ensure that these firms were well stocked to survive the crisis. This gargantuan cash injection propped up the stock market and other U.S. financial markets, which in turn suppressed incipient panic and launched a spike in stock prices. The stock market rise was further fueled by the Federal Reserve pushing the short-term interest rate it controls to near zero. Thus, Wall Street players could borrow cheap money to purchase stocks. The policy interventions in other high-income countries followed broadly similar trajectories during the pandemic. The Bank of International Settlements described these measures as unprecedented in size and scope. As in the United States, the largest interventions involved directly bolstering financial markets through measures such as purchasing assets and guaranteeing fragile loans. The Bank of International Settlements estimated these interventions exceeded 30% of GDP in Germany and Italy, over 20% in Japan, and around 15% in the UK and France. It is true that these 2020 global bailout operations were triggered by the COVID pandemic, not by the breakdown of neoliberal economic policies. But the same bailout operations deployed to counteract the COVID lockdowns have also been mobilized regularly and with increasing force since the beginning of the neoliberal era in the early 1980s. The stock market rise was further fueled by the Federal Reserve pushing the short-term interest rate to near zero, so Wall Street players could borrow cheap money to purchase stocks. Indeed, it was only 13 years ago in 2008 that Wall Street hyper-speculation brought the global economy to its knees during the Great Recession. To prevent a 1930s level depression at that time, economic policymakers throughout the world, including in the United States, the EU, Japan, South Korea, China, India, and Brazil, enacted extraordinary measures to counteract the crisis Wall Street created. As in 2020, these measures included financial bailouts. There were monetary policies that pushed central bank-controlled interest rates close to zero, and large-scale fiscal stimulus programs financed by major expansions in central government deficits. In the United States, the fiscal deficit reached $1.4 trillion in 2009, equal to 9.8% of GDP. The deficits were around $1.3 trillion in 2010, 2011 as well, amounting to close to 9% of GDP in both years. These were the largest peacetime deficits prior to the 2020 COVID recession. The federal government's fiscal deficit had averaged 1.7% GDP in the 58 years prior, between 1950 and 2008. As a share of GDP, the deficit from 2009 to 2011 spiked more than fivefold compared to the post-World War II average. As with the 2020 crisis, the Federal Reserve's interventions to prop up Wall Street and corporate America were even more extensive than the federal government's deficit spending. A careful 2017 study by Better Markets estimated the overall level of financial market support between 2009 and 2012 at $12.2 trillion, about 20% of GDP per year. Moreover, this total figure does not include the full funding mobilized in 2009 to bail out General Motors, Chrysler, Goldman Sachs, and the insurance giant AIG, all of which were facing debt spirals at that time. It is hard to envision the form in which U.S. capitalism might have survived at that time if following true free market precepts as opposed to the actual practice of neoliberal champagne socialism. These and other iconic U.S. firms would have been permitted to collapse. Similar patterns prevailed in Europe during the recession. Among the then 27 countries of the EU, fiscal deficits for 2009 averaged 6.8% of GDP, compared with the 1.8% average between 2001 and 2007, according to the EU Stability and Growth Pact established in 1997 as a means of enshrining a neoliberal project throughout the continent. Annual fiscal deficits were not permitted to exceed 3% of GDP other than in severe recessions. Such recessions were expected to be few and far between, with the added expectation that adhering to neoliberal policy precepts was the best way to ensure this. The European Central Bank also pursued a massive bailout program to buttress the European financial markets. Then President of the ECB, Jean-Claude Trichet, described these measures as an exceptional set of non-standard policy tools that had to be deployed because speculation and financial gambling had run rife, unquote. The measures included driving down the central bank's policy rate, interest rate to almost zero, and providing what Trichet described as unlimited amounts of cash to distressed European banks at the near zero interest rates. Bailout operations of this sort have occurred with clockwork throughout the neoliberal era, beginning with Reagan, and they go into detail on this, which I'm not going to read. They say also, indeed, in February 1999, Time magazine ran an effusive cover story in the immediate aftermath of the emerging markets collapse that brought down, among others, long-term capital management, the super hedge fund led by two Nobel laureates specializing in finance. The story called the then Federal Reserve Chair, Alan Greenspan, Treasury Secretary Robert Rubin, and Deputy Secretary of the Treasury, Larry Summers, quote, the committee to save the world, unquote, due to their ability to execute global bailout operations. It described how, quote, a hedge fund blessed with two Nobel Prize winners blew up in an afternoon, nearly taking Wall Street with it. And, quote again, Brazil is just hanging on, which means so is the rest of Latin America. And yet, quote, these guys, unquote, kept, quote again, a near thing from becoming a disaster, unquote. Greenspan, Rubin, and Summers succeeded in propping up global neoliberalism for a mere 2 years more before the dot-com bubble required yet another bailout. But the 2001 intervention ended up being just a warm-up to the 2008-2009 rescue operation. Still, Greenspan, Rubin, and Summers remained ardent defenders of the global neoliberal order. Of course, they all got very rich from it, apparently seeing no contradiction between the persistent requirement to bail out neoliberalism from impending disasters and their bedrock belief that, quote, trying to defy global market forces is in the end futile. The Borg. Many economists continue to defend the global neoliberal order. They see no trouble in the persistent requirement to bail out neoliberalism from impending disasters. Their perspectives were shared then and continues to be shared today by the overwhelming majority of practicing economists inside academia and out. And they give examples, of that. So Friedman contended that the Federal Reserve could operate as a lender of last resort, could provide bailout funds to the failing banks when no private lender was willing to extend them credit. Yet Friedman never questioned how this observation might conflict with his own overall position that capitalist economies operate most effectively with very minimal levels of government intervention, including a minimal role for the Fed. And Robert Lucas famously said in 2008 that he supported lender of last resort bailouts at that time, since, quote, everyone is a Keynesian in a foxhole, unquote. But like Friedman, Lucas never integrated this position into his analytic models that purport to demonstrate that capitalist economies work best in the absence of government intervention. Following the example of such a major contemporary figures as Friedman and Lucas, there is not, to our knowledge, a single mainstream economics textbook that recognizes bailouts as an indispensable policy tool for enabling capitalism to continue functioning. So then they go into the Minsky, Wall Street paradigm, and Minsky's ideas on financial instability and crises emerging out of the logic of capitalist market activity itself. So that was Minsky's work on stability, which has been okay, going through this then fairly quickly. I think the point is made, the point being that underlying neoliberalism from the very beginning has been champagne socialism, as they call it, or lemon socialism, okay, as I call it. Champagne socialism for the rich, lemon socialism for the rest of us, because it's socialism for the rich, but not for the rest of us. That is what has led to the extreme degree of inequality we see today. So they talk about a re-imaged version of New Deal and social democratic capitalism will have to aggressively address the problems that continue to fester under the original models. However, a critical lesson we can learn from the massive bailout operations of the neoliberal era is that governments in the United States and other advanced economies can mobilize formidable resources to confront the crises. Focusing on the United States, one can readily envision how a re-imaged New Deal, indeed what has come to be called the Green New Deal, can work. The centerpiece must be a massive government-led investment program focused on supplanting our existing fossil fuel dominant energy system that is destroying the planet with a clean energy system that can put us on a viable climate stabilization path. This economy-wide, you see, I lost the thread here. This economy-wide investment project will generate millions of jobs, engage both directly and indirectly in creating a new energy infrastructure. This in turn will open opportunities to revive by union organizing that can deliver higher quality jobs and better living standards. These jobs will need to be open to women and people of color, the population cohorts that have experienced systematic exclusion in U.S. Labor markets for generations. As we write, the Biden administration has taken major positive steps in advancing such a program. The American Jobs Plan Biden introduced in March is a serious, if still inadequate, proposal. It is designed precisely to build a clean energy economy while expanding good job opportunities. Of course, the question arises as to how we can pay for it, for this highly ambitious public sector-led project. There are many ways to credibly answer this question, but we can start most easily by referencing the experience under neoliberalism. As we have seen, there has never been a shortage of financial wherewithal available to bail out a system that is demonstrably unjust and unstable, as well as ecologically calamitous. It should not be difficult to find the financial resources to mount a successful and global Green New Deal over the coming generation. So obviously you see that as good as this article is in certain ways, it talks about finding the financial resources to mount a successful U.S. and global Green New Deal over the coming generation. We don't need to find the financial resources to mount this kind of effort. All we need to do is create the financial resources to mount a successful U.S. and global Green New Deal effort. As you know, I prefer using overt congressional financing and high-value platinum coin seigniorage to create these financial resources. I wish that these University of Massachusetts professors would occasionally say something like that or write something like that. I know they've read enough to know that it can be done. They just don't want to talk that way. I wonder why they don't want to talk that way. It's an interesting question. Anyway, I'll stop sharing that particular article and go on to the good news, the great news. Okay, here's the Fiscal Times giving us the great news. Let's share the screen on that. We very rarely share the Fiscal Times because that's the Peterson rag, the rag that is founded by the Peterson Foundation. This article is by Michael Rainey, July 1st, 2021. The U.S. federal budget deficit will come to $3 trillion in fiscal year 2021, which has, as you know, 3 months to go. This month, August, and September, and it's over. We're 9 months into that fiscal year. According to the latest estimate from the Congressional Budget Office, that latest estimate was just released right now in July. The new projection is about a third higher than CBO's previous analysis from February. So, CBO made an analysis in February for fiscal 2021. The fiscal year had been working October, November, December, January, part of February. So, maybe 4.5 months, and then CBO's previous analysis came out 4.5 months into the fiscal year. And they created a projection at that particular point. And their projection was off by a third. Now, I know it was off by a third. They based their projections on current law, and the American Rescue Plan had not yet passed. So their projection was based on the assumption that there was no American Rescue Plan and that any stimulus that was coming from the government was coming from the act that was passed on a bipartisan basis that Trump signed at the end of December. I forget again what it was called. I just read you the title, a few minutes ago. That was the $980 billion act. So that was within fiscal 2021. They took account of that for their February projection, but of course, come July, they had to have a new projection to take into account the American Rescue Plan and its likely impact. So that's what caused them to be a third off, in their estimate, in just a few months. Driven by massive emergency spending in response to the COVID-19 pandemic, a deficit in 2021 will equal 13.4% of GDP, the second highest level since the end of World War II. Only last year's level of 14.9% of GDP was higher in dollar terms. The 2021 deficit will be about $130 billion smaller. Of course, the bias here in this article and everything the Fiscal Times does, the bias is that, the bigger number is worse. 14.9% is worse. And this new number of, 13.4% is almost as bad as the 14.9%. It's the second worst in history. But we know that it's really good news. The reason why it's good news is because the government's deficit is the private sector's surplus. The private sector's surplus. It means that last year, 14.9% of GDP was net injected by the federal government into the economy. And since it was deficit spending, it was injected into the economy as net financial assets. There was a lot more, of course, that came from the Fed. That was injected, as debt-financed money, basically. In other words, loans, or trades for things that were supposedly worth as much. But that was basically liquidity going into the private sector. The point with respect to deficit spending is that it's not only liquidity going into the private sector, it's not net financial assets going into the private sector. Now, in 2021, with the projection of 13.4%, which, by the way, be alert for the possibility that at the end of September, beginning of October, when we look at the daily Treasury statement, we may find that, in fact, the deficit for the year was 14.3 or 14.5 or 14.9, or even as high as 15%. They don't know now what the exact figure could be. They still have 3 months to go out of the fiscal year. And as you know, their projections can be inaccurate even 3 months out. So there may be even better news than the 13.4%. Okay. So why do I say that 13.4% is good news? Because it may mark more and more vigorous economic expansion from now until the end of the fiscal year. And that will be good for the economy. It will be good for increases, in unemployment. It will be good for spending. It will probably be good for returning the economy more to a near normal state. Why is 14% of GDP needed, or 13% of GDP in deficit spending needed? Because when the economy is operating in a near optimal state, observations of past years show that private sector savings can grow to 6% of GDP. So there's a leakage of spending to savings of 6% of GDP. Furthermore, observations of current account deficits in trading have shown that our current account deficit can rise to something like also 6% per year. That, of course, is a leakage out of the U.S. economy as well. It may be a leakage due to trade, but it's a leakage of dollars outside of the economy of the U.S. So 12% per year in times where the economy is growing can easily be leaked to savings and to trade, which means that for the economy to keep pace and to continue to grow, government, but deficit spending, must also be at that kind of level. Of course, I'm approximating. We don't know the exact level. It depends on the details, okay, of a number of things. Maybe only 8%, maybe 9%, might be 10%, might be 16%, it might be 18%, okay, in a particular year. But if we want to have the economy continuing to grow and continuing to have or not say continuing, but creating a tight labor market, one where labor can prosper and wages can grow, you need to have high deficits from the federal government on the order of fiscal 2020 and fiscal 2021. This 14.9% of GDP and the estimate of the 13.4% of GDP that we see here. It's important to have deficits of that sort. So this is good news. It is not bad news. Now, the article also says after 2021, deficits are projected to decline, CBO said, with the decrease faster and deeper than previously estimated. Deficits are expected to average 1.2 trillion from 2022 to 2031, or about 4.2%, okay, of GDP. If we want the private sector to save a lot of money, and we also want the private sector to be able to buy the foreign goods the private sector wants, deficits of 4.2% of GDP are terrible news. That will produce continuing secular stagnation. The economic situation that saw the slowest recovery in history under Obama, when Joe Biden was vice president. Why did the economy look so bad during these years? Why was the recovery so painful? Why did it produce a recovery which left so many people out that it prepared the way for Trump? Because Obama was happy reducing deficits to 4% a year, to 3% a year, even to 2% a year and below. He worked to reduce those deficits, and they failed to compensate for the losses to savings desires and trading desires. That's why the recovery from the recession of 2008 was so slow under the Obama administration. It was because the mainstream parties believed that the deficit and the debt were problems. And so, as soon as they saw the hint of a recovery, they imposed increasing austerity on spending. And that is what is built into the CBO assumptions. CBO doesn't passively project the future of the economy. What CBO does is it makes certain assumptions. It feeds those assumptions into its model, and out comes the results. And the assumptions that CBO is feeding in is that after these initial very large expenditures to bring the economy that was crippled by COVID back, and back fast, the CBO assumes that federal deficit spending will radically decrease. And that means, of course, that we're going to be looking at 4.2% of GDP, at 3% of GDP, at 2% of GDP, if the Biden administration behaves the way the Obama administration behaved. if they still believe that deficits and the national debt are problems, that is what they will do, and they will produce this kind of lousy economy being projected by the CBO. In spite of that, what CBO, is projecting here, it is still not satisfied with it. It still complains that the kinds of deficits we will see from now until 2031 will be too large, and that our debts will be too large. Debt to climb to record high. The publicly owned portion of the national debt equaled the size of the economy at the end of 2020 fiscal year and will exceed it by the end of 2021, standing at 23 trillion or 103% of GDP. That's not the whole debt, by the way, it's the publicly owned debt. CBO said. That ratio will hover near the 100% level for several years after that before climbing again, reaching about 106% of GDP in 2031. Budget hawks say the CBO's latest budget outlook confirms the need to get a handle on the nation's fiscal trajectory. Today's report underlines the need for us to address our nation's fiscal challenges. That's a statement which was made by Maya McGuinness of the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget, the CRFB, the notorious austerity group, constantly testifying to the Congress about the challenges presented by the debt. There are no challenges presented by the debt. The debt, the national debt, the public debt can be erased by overt congressional financing. As I've continuously explained here, it can be erased by the use of high-value platinum coin seigniorage as well. There are two ways to address the debt fully, because the debt is not really a financial problem. It is a political problem. And these people continue to want to make it a political problem because they gain from the austerity and the high degree of inequality in our country. That's what they want. They want to keep this kind, of inequality, so they want to stop high levels of deficit spending, which, if properly targeted towards the people who need it, would reduce the level of inequality in our society, would make people more independent of the oligarchy. The Maya McGuinnesses of the world don't want to see this. The Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget doesn't want to see this. The Peterson Foundation doesn't want to see this. The Fiscal Times doesn't want to see this. Let us take a look. Well, there's a lot more to take a look at, and I have run out of time. So I will come back, but I gave you links to a few things here. I gave you an update, to the budget from 2019 to 2029 with the actual facts concerning the deficit, the size of the deficit in 2018, and computations of the percent, of GDP. The deficit was 3.9% of GDP in 2018. Then there was a projection at that time that in 2019 it would be 4.4%, of GDP, then 4.6% of GDP, then 4.5% of GDP. These were deficits that were being projected based on the Trump administration's record and what Congress was spending in 2017 and 2018, and also, of course, the state, the economy. That's what was driving these figures about what the percent of GDP, the deficits would be. These are higher percents that were being forecast at the time of the Obama administration, because Trump, of course, had run higher deficits from the start because he passed those large tax cuts. So you see the higher deficits here, as a percent. Next, we go to 2020. The actual for 2020. What was the actual as a percent of GDP? Well, as you know, because I mentioned it already, in fiscal 2020, the size of the deficit was $3.1 trillion. And the percent of GDP was but negative 14.9%. In other words, that is the size of the deficit as a percent of GDP was 14.9%. At that point, there was a projection for fiscal 2021. This was the projection that was made in February of 2021. So they were already 4 months into the year, but of course weren't able to take account of the American Rescue Plan. They could only take account of the relief bill that was passed at the end of calendar year 2020, which, as you know, was in the third month of fiscal 2021. So their projection then was for a 10.3% deficit. That was before the American Rescue Plan. But then they were forecasting for fiscal 2022 4.6% deficit, 4.0% deficit, then radical drops, 3.6%, 4.0%, 3.7, 3.7, and then a rise towards the end of the decade. Of course, this decade was the decade of 2022 to 2031. But 2021 was still a projection. So now we go to another. I keep thinking that I'm sharing this, and actually I haven't been sharing this. So let me share this last one for you here, so you can at least see what I'm talking about. So this is the latest update that just appeared from CBO, in July of 2021. So just a couple of days ago. Now getting to that same spreadsheet again. The actual fiscal 2020 figures were available again. The deficit was 3.1, and the percentage was 14.9%. That was the first, the COVID years. Now their projection, reflecting the passage of the ARP, had gone up to 13.4%. But as I say, don't accept that as a final figure. That could well turn out to be very, very close to the same as in fiscal 2020, because that was a $1.9 trillion bill that was passed was 1.9 trillion over 10 years, but it is delivering a considerable lift to the GDP. And corresponding taxation has not been taking place, so we expect to see a very big deficit. But what suddenly explains the collapse of the deficits? It's the conservative assumptions built into the CBO projection. If there is a reconciliation bill passed now as an amendment to the previous reconciliation bill, and they pass that in this month, and they still have a fiscal 2022 reconciliation bill left over, there's potential for further major expenditures in fiscal 2022. And that means that it's likely that the deficit is going to go way up for 2022, that it won't be 4.7%. It could well be again something like 12 or 13% or 14%, depending on what the Biden administration decides to spend on. There could be very good news coming for the economy as a whole and for individual people, depending on how the spending, is targeted. For myself, I believe it's very unlikely that our deficit spending will fall to 4.7% of GDP or 3.1% of GDP or 2.9%. If it does, it will be bad news. The boom that gets started now may still continue, but if it still continues, it will be because the private sector is blowing a bubble, creating money to finance further expansion of the boom, which of course will mean that somewhere down the line, there's going to be another neoliberal crisis. On the other hand, if the government continues deficit spending at a higher level, sufficient to compensate for the loss to savings, and the loss to foreign trade, then the economy can continue to grow, can continue the just transition to the Green New Deal, actually begin the just transition, to the Green New Deal, and begin and extend the Green New Deal spending that we're going to need to get ourselves out of that particular fix. But what I'm telling you is these projections by the CBO are BS. They are a function of the assumptions they put into their model. And assumptions in that model are basically Republican assumptions. They sort of assume that Congress is going to be in deadlock, or the Republicans are going to take over, that what they'll be doing primarily is maybe tax cutting and maybe nothing, and that there'll be very little growth, in the economy too. You can see what their forecasts mean in terms, of growth. Let's see if we can find a line item here that can express the growth as a percentage. Let me see. No, I don't see it. I can easily compute it. Okay, so there is GDP, gross domestic product. Let's see. That's the problem. I don't have the gross domestic product down there as a line item. So let me just show you this. It will only take a minute. Just below debt held by the public, this row here. In fiscal 2020, there we go. Fiscal 2020, the GDP was $21 trillion. They're projecting for fiscal 2021, 22.4 trillion. So that means that they're projecting growth of roughly 1.5%. It's a little less, but 1.5%. 2022, let's just make sure I have the columns correct here. Yeah, it's the third one in. In 2022, 24.3 divide 22.4. I must have made a mistake in that. 24.3 divided by 22.4. So they're projecting an 8.5% increase in the economy with sorry, I can't easily find the line item. I need with the deficit falling from 13.4% in 2021 to 4.7% in 2022. That is not going to happen. I can tell you that. That is not going to happen. With only a deficit, of 5%, that's not going to happen. We're going to lose too much to savings and too much to trade, to allow that to happen. There can't be an 8% gain. Now they have, let's look at 2023 compared to 2022. That's 25.3 divided by 24.3. So they expect a 4% gain there. That might be possible, depending on what the private sector does, and what the foreign sector does. But I'm going to go on record here as saying, without a bank bubble in 2023, to really extend a sufficient amount of credit to people, there's no way that we're going to have growth between fiscal 2022 and fiscal 2021 of 8.5% of the economy. I mean, this projection is simply ridiculous. We might get that kind of growth in the economy if we again have 13 or 14%, okay, of GDP deficit, but we aren't going to have it here. It's impossible. So, okay, I wanted to show you these figures. I wanted also to explain to you why these projections are worth nothing. Okay, at this point, of course, they're totally subject to change as well due to policy changes. But this is just a meaningless drill. So I guess all I have to say about this, today, I've given you links to these the CBO reports, so you can see the sheets for yourself and do some elementary calculations on your calculators to get at the rates of growth. Okay, but anyway, we have good news for this year. In fact, I think it's going to be better news than the 13.4% deficit. It may get into the 14-point range. For next year, there's going to have to be more activity by the Democrats, okay, in Congress to get more deficit spending done, okay, in order to create a decent amount of further growth for fiscal 2000, okay, in 22. But if it turns out our deficit shrinks to 4.7%, we're going to see a big pullback in the economy also, a big slowdown in the recovery from COVID. Okay, so now I'm going to turn to your questions. You may by now have a lot of them. I see you're all still here. Oh, Mr. Chaos is here too. Hey, Chaos. How you? Well, Chaos is doing a number of things that I think we can just ignore. We sort of kind of look forward to Chaos joining us, but Chaos really doesn't create any chaos, so we're not really too troubled by him. So as Kyle is fighting, I know he's fighting with Jimmy Dore, but why would he get taken off? Because, oh, I see, when you say Kyle's about to be canceled, you're saying he's going to be canceled by Jimmy Dore. I thought you were talking about he's going to be canceled by YouTube. Carmen says, I'm well, Joe, thanks. About to dig into my sugar-free fruit salad Jell-O snack. And Ghostart says, Lana Bana Bobama. And my daughter Devora is here. Hi, honey. Kay says, hey, Devora. Bonnie says, hey, everyone. Devora says, hi, Mom. Kay says, wonder if this heat wave will last all summer. Carmen says, the Gulf of Mexico is on fire, and they're using water hoses from aboard ships to douse it. That's not going to do much good, is it? Steve says, wish I could say that. She died of Alzheimer's. Sorry, Steve. Steve says, hi, Joe. Hi, Steve. Okay, says, does anyone think this heat wave will wake anyone up to climate change? Yeah, I think people are being woken up to climate change. They're experiencing it. It's hard to deny it's not due to climate change. I think in the Pacific Northwest, probably a lot of people just got a very rude awakening. A very rude awakening. I expect to see some changes. I expect to see some more Republicans thrown out of Congress. Kay says, nowhere to hide from climate disasters. And Carmen says, Common Dreams got thrown in fascist book jail. I don't know if it's been resolved, but I saw a post just a couple of hours ago that they violated community standards. Well, who violated the community standards? Did Common Dreams actually post one of its own articles to Facebook? Or did somebody else post a link to a Common Dreams article? I just posted a link to a Common Dreams article, didn't I? I had a number of Common Dreams articles. Of course, I didn't post to that particular article yet. I was planning on doing that on Tuesday. Carmen says, corrections, got standards. Sorry, my keyboard skips and slips. Evelina says, Biden and much of his cabinet are truly out of touch with the urgency people feel. They talk about doing this and that, but when they're going to start already. I don't know. Exactly, Evelina Ponte. Evelina says, next year, the year after that. When Kay says, as per usual, too little and too late, Evelina Ponte. Evelina says, I'm convinced these politicians just think they won't be touched by it. Ghost Dot says, finally reached 1,000 Twitters on JA's 50th. And Kay says, seems like it, Evelina Ponte, but there'll be nowhere to hide from it. Evelina says that they won't experience the climate crisis, not they nor their families. Everybody experiences it in some way. KRTD Media says, Morning Joe Firestone rewinds have been selected from 7:5 until 9:3, which is when we'll have to look for more. Everyone can catch them at KRTD Media at 10 a.m. Eastern Time on Monday. KRTD Media says you should tell everyone about how Howie will be appearing on your show soon and remind everyone about the What If show. Okay, I will, Shane. So, next Thursday, I evidently have a booking with Howie Hawkins, who's going to be my guest for the Thursday night show, okay, at 9 o'clock. So that's coming attractions. Howie Hawkins, of course, is the 2020 candidate for president of the Green Party. He's a very nice guy. I expect to have a very friendly conversation with him. I'm sure we'll get into deep matters, but I'm also sure it's going to be very cordial, and it should be a lot of fun, and I invite you all to come. And there is Chaos Ing. You haven't quoted the MET comment. Zhao Ming and Kay Jonig. I'm sorry, Chaos. If you want to put in some links, I've been inviting you to putting links, but you have no links because you have no economists. We all know that. So how long are you going to play this game? Kay says most people don't really understand until they have to deal with it. The politicians don't want to turn off their lobbying group. And chaos keeps going on and on. And keeps basically giving us crap. And then he says, Chair Jerome Powell, Bill Gates, former Treasury Secretary Larry Summers, and former IMF Chief Economist, Kenneth Rogoff, all attacked the theory. Well, Ken Rogoff and Carmen Reinhart are the biggest gaffers of all, because they produced papers that led governments in Europe to apply choking austerity, which led to extremely high unemployment rates. And then 2-3 years later, people found spreadsheet errors in their work. They failed to prove what they set out to prove, and also analytical problems galore, which were first pointed out by MMTers in 2010, but later by econometricians and graduate students at the University of Massachusetts and Amherst and at UMKC as well. And all I can say is, when they got through, nothing was left of the work of Carmen Reinhardt and Kenneth Rogoff. Reinhardt and Rogoff were totally discredited. Nothing remains of their thesis that the debt to GDP ratio counts for anything when it comes to predicting economic growth or stagnation. But their austerity theory was certainly totally discredited. So Evelina says, not everyone will be affected at the same time. There will be regions of the country that will get hit first and harder, just like regions of the world are in a crisis already. Migration's taking place. Kay says, we have broken the northern jet stream, and so we are screwed. Says Kay, and Evelina says, taking place. And Chaos says, I'm not going to go over what Chaos says because there's too much nonsense based on what Chaos says. Chaos says, I am a great MMTer. And Chaos says to the world, don't you understand anything? And Kay says, Siberia is burning. What does that tell you? The Gulf of Mexico is burning. What does that tell you? The earth is burning. Evelina says, hope the gods hurl them into a frickin' centrifuge in the ocean. I swear. Kay says, the gods have little to do with it. Okay. It's us humans that cause this mess. Chaos says, I am a great MMTer. I've been doing MMT for 88.3 years. What part of provide links don't you understand, Chaos Eng? Chaos says, I am the link. Ghostart says, the missing link. Ghostart, show some respect for the greatest MMTer of the 1940s. In the 1940s, I was one of the first MMTers. There were no MMTers, Chaos, until the 1990s. The first MMT synthesis dates from 1994, and the author of it was Warren B. Mosler. Ghostart says, Lance Link? Lance Link? What's Lance Link? And Kay says, mostly ultra-rich and powerful humans, I might add. Chaos says, show some respect. You show some respect. Where are your links, Chaos? You have been challenged. You failed to meet the challenge. You are nowhere, Chaos. Everybody is laughing at you. Steve Whitman says, hey, Doc, I spent the afternoon at a barbecue with Jimmy Dore and Steph and the entire, Steph Zamorano, of course, and the entire convo couch. When I hear the name Steph, the first thing I think of is Stephanie Kelton, I'm afraid. So I have to rewire my brain now. And the entire convo couch and Glorianne, Steve, of Slow News Day. I know who that is. Though only one thing that could beat that the only thing that could beat that WPA. WPA? What's that? Evelyn says, sounds like you had a good time, Steve. Kay says, wish the rest of us had someone to keep us up and going. Hey, Doc, spent the afternoon at barbecue. Steve, something young, me beat that. would be to meet you face to face. I might take the drive out there. Well, you're welcome, Steve. It's a long drive from LA to Ashburn, Virginia. It's on the other side of the United States. Kay says, Convo Couch is in your area, so bet that was cool for you. Steve says, we could have a cup of coffee. We could have more than a cup of coffee. We could have some champagne, Steve. Carmen says, yay, good, great news coming up. Or a beer. Steve says, yeah, we are friends. We are, Steve. We are friends. We have been friends from the beginning. Lana says, Dr. Joe, you mentioned unemployment, which reminded me to share this from Carolyn McClanahan. If you filed for unemployment anytime in 2021, you are eligible for free or reduced medical care. Here is the link. Okay, leave the link, Lana. I don't see it, but leave the link for people to see. Steve says, I'm not a player by any means, but I have met and know these people, and they are very cool. I'm glad you've met them. I'm sure they are very cool people. Kay says, I saw the pic you shared. John Tickler says, profits removed from the previous period must be replaced with debt by loaning the profits back into the economy. John Tickler, what are you talking about? Wealth is the measure of indenturement of future producers and production. John Tickler, I don't understand anything you're saying. Steve Wolfbrand said, and I love them dearly. I'm glad, Steve. Lana says, I am recently getting mail from that responsible budget group I roll. Not sure how they got my info. When I have more time, I will send MMT info just for grins. Well, but I every once in a while go over to the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget to see what nonsense they're spouting. I read the Fiscal Times, actually, fairly frequently. I read the news releases of the Peterson Foundation, because they're always on top of the BS from that corner of the world. You just got to read that. You got to keep up with that stuff. You got to know what your enemies are doing. That's it. Kay says, I know I'm damn sick of being so poor. We all are. Ghost Dud says, Henry Winkler, H. Winkler for real. We are so divided as a country, only a cataclysmic event that makes us depend on one another again can bring us back together. Well, unfortunately, with climate change, we get a lot of little cataclysmic events going on. I mean, collectively, we're in a cataclysmic event. It's just a rolling cataclysm. It's not a one-time cataclysm. Unfortunately, our intention deficit disorder prevents us from paying attention to a rolling cataclysm. That's the problem. John Tickler says, neoliberal myth 1, business owners pay taxes vicariously through the income produced by jobs they create. John Tickler says, human domestication. I thought that was slavery, John. Carmen says, I know Lana knows everything you're talking about when it comes to sorry, I lost the thread. I know Lana knows everything you're talking about when it comes to projection, rates of growth, etc. I think she gets the gist of it, yes. Kay says, human genocide. Gostart said, there's global plague and fire. The ocean is on fire. Infrastructure is collapsing. Autocracy is rising. Insurrectionists storm the Capitol. So I'll just assume you know something new about the UFOs. Nope. The first time I read about the UFOs was back in 1947. I believe I was 8 years old. That's the first time I heard of Major Donald Keyhoe. Major Keyhoe and the flying saucers. John Tickler says 30 years too slow on climate, maybe 40 years too slow on climate. We were first learning a material amount about climate change in the 1960s. By the early 1970s, that's 50 years ago, we were being told about the climate crisis back then, that there would be a climate crisis. We've had 50 years of warning. We started doing something under Jimmy Carter. Then, well, I'm not going to put the whole blame on the ignorance, of people, because it was partly due to Carter. If Carter had been a smarter politician, he could have stayed in office. But for people to have made the choice, of Ronald Reagan over Jimmy Carter as president of the United States, that was gross idiocy. Gross idiocy. John Tickler says 30 years too slow on climate. Yes. The deniers, egg the deniers. I don't know what that means. Lana says FB has some odd community standards. They're in collaboration with the government. They're doing government propaganda these days. Carmen says, looking forward to the Howie appearance. Oh, I also am going to remind you about the What If program. We'll be starting our What If program. We hope to have it done by the end of June, but of course, lots of things happen to intervene, like the Twitter war. We hope to finish it by July 1st, but we didn't make our deadline. And the reason why we didn't make our deadline is because there was a serious Twitter war where many of the MMTers coming out of the RP group were giving what for to the whole Washington people because they were advocating for a state-based Medicare for All program. And it fell to me to defend the whole Washington people as suggesting something reasonable as long as they weren't doing anything at the federal level. And I did that, and it took an awful lot of time since I was the one drafting the scripting material for the What If show. The first series within the What If show is based on the idea of what if Elizabeth Warren had decided to run for the presidency in 2015 when Bernie urged her to. That's what it's going to be about. I think that series is going to be dynamite, and I hope you will look forward to it. I will keep you updated as we get closer and closer to the release of the series. At least the two of you have now volunteered to serve as part of a very small focus group that we'll be trying out our conversations on before we actually pull the trigger on the series. So, Lana says, super, I like Howie and also his running mate, Angela. Yes. And Kay says, cool, I like Howie. Kay says, can we get euthanasia legalized. Um, uh, 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 I'm about ready. Uh, okay. I'm not going to give a response to that, Kay. The only thing, Kay, that I will say is I tend to project my anger outward rather, Kay, than inward. So I don't think I will be doing any euthanasia anytime soon. Ghost Art says, fireworks just look like coronavirus to me. And John Tickler says, there are no gods but the ones created by man to prove his authority over others. Well, we find something we agree upon, John Tickler. Lana says, lots of firework booms going off around here already. We haven't heard any firework booms here yet, have we? Have we heard fireworks?
Yeah, I thought you heard it at the beginning of the show.
Oh, were there fireworks out there? Huh, well. Kay says, Gulf of Mexico burning is the fault of fossil fuels. Yes, but the burning we're seeing in the Arctic is also the fault, okay, of fossil fuels. Indirectly the fault, okay, of fossil fuels because of the release of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. And by the way, methane is a greenhouse gas. Carmen says, the weakest link, Ghost Start, meaning chaos, attention, seeking. Ghost Start says, Lance Link, super chimp. Steve Wolfbrand says, when the wind kick up, California will burn again. Lana Bell says, I think that YouTube belated my info re those who applied for unemployment in 2021 and free or ref. Can you get it again from Carolyn McClanahan? Carmen says, Joe, you can make banana peel bacon with banana peels and smoked paprika, and it's good. So what do? Do you fry the banana peels? Lana says, reduced Medicare, go to healthcare. Okay, reduced Medicare, go to healthcare.gov. Okay. Unfortunately, I have not been among the unemployed for some time. I've been self-employed for a very, very, very long time now. Okay, of course, I'm also on Social Security, but I have been self-employed. Carmen says, we can only hope the ETs finally land and save the planet. Chaos says, MMT was started in 1824 by Rob K. Boons. And show me the proper respect, and ha ha ha, I deserve you. Do you know who I am? First person to reintroduce MMT in 1943 UFOs was a reply to Henry Wink Wink Nod Nod. And Steve Wolfbrand says the UFL, what's the, unidentified flying objects. That's the UFOs. Cass says, I've been doing MMT for 88.3337 years. Cass is actually pretty funny. John says, agreed 40 years, and says the paper on CO2 did not assess impact on climate. And so Lana says, I wonder who John Tickler is. He seems to know my name, but I don't recognize him. His name is spelled Tikler. Chaos Ang says, as an idea, it could convince some Democrats to break away from the view that spending also has to be paid for with tax increases. Hopefully it will, Chaos. Yes, hopefully it will. Chaos says, I wonder why you won't respect me. Because you don't provide any links, Chaos. Kay says, I remember when the Cuyahoga River was on fire in Ohio in 1970. I have no idea. I mean, on Facebook, one can block people.
Facebook, well, if you tell Facebook you're having a problem.
Right, but Chaos is not coming in over Facebook. Chaos is coming in over YouTube. And I don't know how to block anybody on YouTube. And I'm not much of a block person, I mean, I don't block people, I just deal with people. And Ghostot says, oops, Lancelot Link, secret chimp, #respect. Carmen says, yes, you fry the banana peels. Do you fry the banana peels in oil? Or you simply fry the dried banana peels, the dried banana peels with the smoked paprika on them.
How can you dry them? Don't they get slimy?
Steve says the UFOs are real and Michelle is a man. Howie is an idiot. Is that what you're trying to say? Howie is an idiot? I don't think that. Lana says, any link that gets posted to YouTube gets deleted. I should have remembered that. It seems to get flagged as spam. That's why I finally spelled out healthcare.gov. Thank you. You know what I think, though, Lana? When you post things in top chat, okay, in other words, in YouTube, there are two ways to comment. There's the top chat. The top chat does not survive the live stream. It goes away when the live stream is no longer live. But the public comments, you have to scroll down to the very bottom of the screen and find the comment area. When you find the comment area, if you leave comments there, they remain with the video record of the stream. So that may be what you're talking about. You may have to go to the comment area and leave the link there. I think links are allowed in YouTube because I have commented on posts before on YouTube, and I've left plenty of links. Okay, I think there may be some rule that you can't leave more than 3 links or something like that. But all you have to do to get around that is leave the links, okay, in multiple posts. Okay, but anyway, I think that can be easily done. Ghostot says, Lancelot Link, what do you think about life, Lancelot Link? Aunt Mata Hari is your wife. You've been searching around for a clue, and now you don't know what to do. Steve Wolfbrand says, an idiot, he is Howie. Steve, nevertheless, I will ask you that when Howie comes to call, that you be polite and you do not call him an idiot. You may disagree or you want to raise questions in the comments. I will certainly take the questions, but there are civility rules that I would like you to follow when I have a guest. Number 1, civility rule. Do not call people names. Number 2, do not label what they think without explaining the label. In other words, no unwarranted types of labeling. If you're going to label people in some way, you have to make the case that the label is justified. In other words, the comment will have to be a long one with a citation, of evidence. Number 3, no arguments from authority. Those are logical fallacies. We criticize views and we criticize arguments based on reason. We let the reasoned objections contend, and we all make up, our own minds about who is right, if anybody. And number 4, civility rule. Number 4, civility rule. No ad hominem arguments. In other words, when you're making arguments, don't argue against the person because of the personal characteristics of the person or the associations of the person. Argue against the position which the person is taking. So those are the 4 rules. No ad hominems, no labeling without explanation, no name calling, and no arguments from authority. Got it? Those are the civility rules. Carmen says, in coconut oil, oh gee, we have plenty of coconut oil. You can make banana peel bacon in coconut oil. Does it get real crisp? Steve says, muchim. Chaos says. Steve says, she's a man. Evelina says, that's NASA. Kay says, thank you for being here tonight, Joe. I hate holidays for news coverage. Okay, I love you all. And we love you, Kay. Steve Wolfbrand says, okay, Doc. Okay, Steve. And Carmen Muniz says, girls who eat a banana peel bacon. That's a link. There's a link to girls who eat banana peel bacon. So Chaos says, you should be able to show me respect. Chaos, all in all, I have to say, I think that I've been treating you pretty well. Better than you've been treating me. Steve Wolfbrand says, I'll be nice. I didn't say nice, Steve. I said civil. There's a difference. You can put up all kinds of comments that cut anybody to ribbons, including me, if you observe those 4 rules while doing it. You may find it difficult. It ain't easy to follow those 4 rules, and be rigorous about it. And if you want to know who first advanced those rules, it was Karl Popper. Those are his rules for civility. And Chaos is going, he, ha, ha, ha. And Lana says, I am sure there is a video on making banana peel bacon. And Steve says, I'll be nice, Doc, but she's a man. Okay, guys, good night. Have a happy 4th tomorrow, as happy as it can be when the country is in such a foul state. in such a foul state with foul acts like keeping Julian in prison. Oh, by the way, did anybody see the live stream that we did at KRTD Media yesterday? We had a news program. It ran from something like 4 to a quarter to 6 in the evening. You can find it at KRTD Media if you haven't seen it already. I think you might like the conversation. We talked about a number of good things. We talked about the gray zone and the victory won by the gray zone in court. But thank you, Dolores, and good night to you. And Pet Chaos is sort of spouting a mix of nonsense and truth there in what he said. And Evelina waves. Lana says good night and happy 4th. And anyway, I thought I'd take the opportunity to remind you of that KRTD Media cast, which I think came out pretty well. So take a look at it. Carmen says, can't enjoy the 4th. Too many will be super spreading for the Dow. For the Dow. And Lana says, I was out running around to appointments yesterday. I did not see it yet. Well, thank you for wanting to see it, Lana. John Tickler said, thanks, and enjoy the 4th to celebrate a country able to change. John, I think that's the problem. We don't know whether this country, is able to change. And we don't know whether it's able to change in the right directions, in one of the right directions, because there are multiple paths. At this point, I'm afraid that it can only change in the wrong direction. Steve says, sweet dreams. Kay says, I hope so. Steve is about to repeat. And Michelle is, on that note, I'm going to say good night and have a happy 4th.